In addition to Sarah Ferguson, we also need to go on to Beatrice and Eugene, who have been brought into this. Music. In the past, we talked on the show about whether the royal family has essentially music, maintained their titles, and whether they should be affected by what is happening to their parents. The files were meant to remain hidden indefinitely. These of the world's most influential individuals had spent years bussing their entire existence on the absolute assurance that these documents would never be published. They attended royal receptions, cut ribbons at charity events, and grinned for the cameras, music completely certain that the darkest connections have been removed from the past. They were mistaken when, in early 2024, the Department of Justice finally released a vast and comprehensive set of records pertaining to the notorious financier. The shockwaves shook more than just Wall Street boardrooms and Washington's political corridors. They landed like a bomb at the center of the British royal family after crossing the Atlantic Ocean and avoiding the usual suspects. Prince Andrew had long been the focus of the world's cameras. As they awaited the next gloomy chapter of his stunning decline from grace, the public was essentially holding their breath. However, the music that surfaced from those deleted pages headed in a direction that no one had expected. It was aimed toward a mother. It was aimed toward her daughters. Additionally, it brought up such deeply troubling issues that seasoned royal correspondents and musicians, who had dedicated their whole careers to reporting they said they were physically horrified by the monarchy's scandals. It is not conjecture that we are going to investigate. It's not some wild, clickbait-driven tabloid dream. It is recorded. The music record has it. Additionally, royal insiders are discreetly calling. It is the biggest danger to the legitimacy of the monarchy in a generation. You must comprehend Sarah Ferguson's personality and how the cruel machinery of the royal family made her extremely susceptible in order to appreciate the full scope of what these documents disclose. Music. She became well known worldwide as Fergie after marrying Prince in 1986. Andrew, going right into music, the harsh, glaring scrutiny of one of the world's most closely watched organizations. She was a really complex person from the beginning. Unlike the other royals, she was friendly, impulsive, boisterous, humorous, and intensely relatable. She didn't behave in the cold, collected manner that the palace required. She chuckled a bit too loudly. She was a bit careless with her spending. She spoke too candidly. She infused a centuries-old organization that valued total control with a chaotic, erratic human energy. Above everything else, she was revered by the British tabloids, but they also chastised her equally. One week they would make her a national treasure, and the next they would completely destroy her, making fun of her weight, style, and mistakes. She was never able to break out from the poisonous cycle. Get away. Sarah had rapid, widespread, and extremely severe financial and social repercussions when her marriage to Andrew finally failed, and the divorce was finalized in 1996. Ferguson discovered that, in contrast to other members of the royal family who continued to enjoy their lavish positions, their enormous estates, and their assured incomes, she was cast out into the cold. She had ceased to be a working royal. She lost her HR designation, and all of a sudden she had to manage an extravagant lifestyle that she could no longer afford. Over the years, reports have regularly depicted a bleak image of a woman experiencing ongoing oppressive financial hardship. Debt levels were frighteningly high, profitable music agreements fell through, the enormous quantity she spent was always greater than the money she was able to make, and that background is very important. It's important because when you really understand how the relationship Sarah Ferguson eventually formed with a millionaire financier starts to make a different kind of horrible, sickening sense in the years after her royal exile, when she was financially desperate, emotionally alone, and publicly abused. Let's provide a thought-provoking inquiry before we examine the precise words she wrote. If a person you know, would you continue to have a close, warm, and emotionally invested personal relationship with someone who had been found guilty of soliciting intimacy from a minor, had music documented their acts, and been put to an actual prison? Would you take a seat and write them letters referring to them as your brother, music, legend, amazing, and unique companion? The majority of regular individuals would instantly, instinctively, and without hesitation say no. However, the unsealed music files show just that about Sarah Ferguson. Not once, not in a brief moment of bewilderment or poor judgment, but repeatedly, persistently. And in writing, long after it was clear who this man was and what he had done to young girls. A picture of a casual arm's-length relationship did not surface when the records were scrutinized by major news outlets. This was not the kind of courteous relationship you might have with a wealthy benefactor. Momentarily at a dinner for charity, the relationship between Sarah Ferguson and this convicted predator was depicted in the emails as being intensely emotional, committed, and occasionally remarkably music personal. In one particular email, Ferguson is thought to have written it directly to him. She allegedly said that she was at a loss for words to express how much she loved and appreciated his kindness and generosity. She concluded the message with a line that put a complete stop to investigative journalists who were reading it. "I am at your service," she wrote. "Take a moment to consider that." Moment, I'm here to help, written by a woman who was parenting 2 girls at the time to a man who had a criminal record. This particular feature is what turns ordinary unease into something far darker, almost menacing. The email was not sent prior to the crimes were discovered. It wasn't the sorrowful, misdirected message of a gullible woman who had no idea who she was actually interacting with. These texts have an extremely clear and obvious timeline. He had already been found guilty when that email was sent. It was sent following the well-publicized court processes, the guilty plea, and the world's plain and permanent knowledge of his actions. It was by no means an isolated incident. In an email dated August 3, 2009, the strange correspondence went on music. According to reports, Ferguson called him the She had always wanted a brother. She referred to music as her beloved, amazing, and unique companion in subsequent communications. He was a legend, she wrote. In fact, she expressed her pride in him. The public's reaction to that remark alone was intense and hateful when it leaked, proud of a man who was either incarcerated or recently freed from prison for child exploitation. Then came another music message, which could have been the most psychologically insightful of them. "I am at your service," Ferguson allegedly wrote to him. "Just marry me." There was intense disagreement among observers, psychologists, and commentators over the precise meaning of those 4 words. Some contended that they demonstrated a true, perverted emotional connection in which Ferguson had psychologically fallen in love with him in a way that totally subordinated her moral judgment, whereas others concentrated on a different, possibly far more unsettling reading. This, they contended, was not love, it was pure desperation. This was a woman who had fallen from the top echelons of British society and had become totally dependent on a guy in terms of money, emotions, and social interactions. Music that, since the financial and emotional aspects of this connection are inextricably linked, she would write anything to keep his favor and stay near his wealth. During this whole time, Sarah Ferguson was burdened with crippling debt that would devastate her life. The individual she was writing to, on the other hand, seemed to be endlessly wealthy. In reality, a recording that later came to light and garnered a lot of media attention included a discussion about a direct payment of £500,000, along with references to a deposit that was already waiting in a safe. Overall, the image does not depict a royal leading a life of honorable charity. It tells the story of a woman who let herself become strongly musically attached to a known criminal. The public found it extremely troubling to see that she was financially reliant on him, emotionally attached to him, and, based on her own written words, fiercely devoted to him. All of that alone would make music a huge global scandal. It would be a somber tale about a public figure who has fallen from grace and made a series of ethically reprehensible decisions. However, this tale extended beyond Sarah Ferguson's personal life. It overflowed into her children's lives. At this point, the story completely changes, going from being merely unsettling to something that many individuals who closely followed the case described as truly music terrifying. Prior to the disastrous disclosure of these files, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie were 2 young ladies who had music was able to keep a dignified, significant distance from the worst of their parents' never-ending disputes. Their father was neither Beatrice nor Eugenie. They weren't their mum. They had created their own distinct personalities with great grace and effort, their own reputations and their quiet public lives. In particular, Eugenie had developed true hard-won respect. She was well known for her grounded demeanor and her intense dedication to spreading awareness of human trafficking and modern slavery music. That particular feature, the fight against human trafficking, has a cruel irony that is nearly too difficult to comprehend when compared to what these unsealed data disclose. because the information in the documents regarding their mother's purported actions and the things she reportedly exposed them to shocked elite royal circles and continues to reverberate behind the palace walls nowadays. Every single date in this sequence holds a great deal of deadly weight, therefore let's navigate the timeline of events with surgical precision. After serving his very contentious sentence after his 2008 conviction, the millionaire was freed from his Florida jail facility in July 2009. There was no secret about his release. It was a huge public gathering. The world press covered it extensively. Music, the specifics of his transgressions were completely known to the public. Everyone who had access to a newspaper or television knew exactly what he had been found guilty of. 5 days, Sarah Ferguson packed her luggage and went to Miami to see him just 5 days after he left that prison cell. However, she wasn't traveling alone. Music, Beatrice and Eugenie accompanied her. At the moment, Beatrice was 19 years old. Eugenie was just 17. They had not yet reached adulthood in the most complete autonomous musical sense. By all fair standards, these young women were totally dependent on their mother to make judgments that safeguarded their welfare, safety and reputation. The travel is unquestionably confirmed by an email received on July 24 of that year by one of the financier's top assistants. Even later, Ferguson acknowledged that she had actually gone to Miami with her girls at that same moment. Additionally, the man they were visiting allegedly paid for all of their travel expenses. 5 days after his release from a term involving a juvenile, he paid for her teenage daughters. There aren't many ways to present that particular set of facts that don't take one down a very dark and extremely unsettling path. When this material surfaced online, commentators and members of the public started asking the same question: what must a parent be considering or willfully disregarding in order to make that choice? How can you look at your own kids, pack their bags, and take them on a global flight to see a man who recently served music time for the exploitation of a young person? However, this was not a singular instance of poor decision-making. It wasn't an isolated error committed in a panic. It was an extension of a deeply ingrained, extremely structured framework of elite agreements, apologies, and access. What the trip to Miami exposes about what had been fully accepted in Sarah Ferguson's environment is what makes it so unsettling. There is more than one visit listed in the papers. They reveal a persistent. Ferguson seems to intentionally encourage continued casual contact between this man and her daughters over a period of several years. Another email appeared in March 2010. In it, Ferguson was asked by the investor if one of her daughters might give him a special tour of Buckingham Palace's music backstage. The request was presented in a light-hearted, almost casual manner, as if gaining access to the heart of the British monarchy were a small favour that should be requested without much fanfare. Ferguson reportedly responded with simply 2 words. Naturally, there would be no reluctance or pause to think about the consequences. Let's be very clear about what Buckingham Palace truly stands for. It's not the lobby of a hotel. It is not a museum that everyone can simply stroll into. It serves as the British monarch's official residence in London. Entry to its inner sanctuaries is strictly regulated, highly symbolic, and completely off-limits to a convicted criminal under any reasonable combination of circumstances. However, the document trail indicates that Sarah Ferguson negotiated that extraordinary access with seemingly ease, displaying no internal anguish about what she was doing or who she was bringing into the royal fold. There was another email, which observers and behavioral specialists noted as especially instructive. In reality, Ferguson was apologizing to him since her girls couldn't spend a certain weekend with him. One had been gone in France, she clarified, and the other had been out with a companion. According to reports, Ferguson joked that this demonstrated that she didn't crack the whip when it came to scheduling her girls. It is nearly hard to overestimate the importance of her tone in that statement. She wasn't expressing regret for skipping a formal social event or gala duty. In a tone that made their frequent access to him seem like a permanent agreement, she was apologizing to a registered predator for her teenage daughter's absence. It sounded ordinary, it sounded predictable. In another message, he even inquired as to whether Ferguson's daughters could meet and welcome a buddy of his who was in London. Music, once more it was presented informally. Once more Ferguson allegedly handled it like any other ordinary request. Music Princess Beatrix's 18th birthday celebration followed. The age of 18 is a significant occasion that honors a young woman's transition into adulthood and is typically attended by her closest relatives and close friends. When the public found out that this man had attended the extremely private gathering that her mother had probably invited. Additionally, when a picture from the event started making the rounds online, the response was one of widespread disgust. When combined, these specifics create a massive wall of data that defies explanation as a sequence of oops, what they characterize as an other reality in which a predator's access to young royal women has been fully arranged, normalized, and regarded as a routine aspect of everyday life. Music, responsible reporting requires us to be really specific about what occurs next. A royal insider came forward during the fallout and made a horrifying accusation. International journalists took notice of that accusation and covered it. It has never been established in any court of law or legal action, and Sarah Ferguson has fiercely, firmly, and constantly rejected it. It is still an unconfirmed assertion from an unidentified source. However, the people did not just brush it off, thus it is essential to talk about knowing why. It is necessary to examine the context in which this rumor originated in order to understand why it got such widespread momentum. Sarah Ferguson was accused of aggressively pressuring her own daughters to sleep in the financier's bed, which was a terrible accusation. Here's why, despite her quick and clear rejection, so many onlookers were unable to put an end to the discussion. This accusation was not heard by the public in a vacuum. 5 days after his release, they heard it against the backdrop of his journey to Miami. They heard it in addition to the informal Buckingham Palace tour arrangement. They awaited the invitation to the birthday celebration and the emails praising him as a legend and a source of pride. People find it psychologically impossible to ignore an unverified accusation that would seem completely ludicrous in any other situation when there is an overwhelming amount of documented, indisputable evidence. This is because the boundaries of what they previously believed to be possible have already been so violently broken. When does a persistent pattern of documented unsettling behavior permanently change our perception of what is credible? There is another, more subdued aspect of this tale that has gotten much less attention from the general public, but it illustrates something profound about the psychological hold this circumstance has had on the family. Sarah Ferguson once conducted an interview with a reporter. According to reports, it was a deliberate public relations effort to influence how she was portrayed in the media and to project a more positive, sympathetic image of herself. However, upon viewing the final article, the financier was allegedly incensed by the outcome. He told Ferguson how deeply unhappy he was. Her email response was chillingly compliant. She talked about having a conversation with little betrayal and the two of them, mother and daughter, coming to the understanding that the journalist needed to be contacted right away. They concurred that the reporter should be chastised and taught not to make mistakes when covering this man. It was astounding how the financier was described in the email. It stated that he had been wrongfully imprisoned, that he had served his time with dignity, that he was going on with his life, and that his reputation should be honored in paper. In one particular email, we see a mother and her young daughter sitting in a room, reasoning together, and coming to the bizarre conclusion that their main responsibility was to manage a convict's public relations. The forensic psychologists and child development specialists who examined this part of the narrative took great care to present it in a nuanced manner. They made the point that what appears to be a young person independently supporting their parents' opinions typically represents something much deeper. Years of constant, unrelenting exposure to a parent's distorted viewpoint. A young person's brain can be shaped in ways that appear completely real to them, but are actually the result of long-term, intensive influence, particularly when that parent has complete control over the child's social and financial life. The term conditioning was employed by the specialists. They made it clear that this was not the same as a youngster willfully taking part in misconduct, but it was also far different from innocent autonomous accord. It's possible that betrayal honestly thought she was expressing her own moral beliefs, but did she ever really have the psychological freedom to think critically about the men her mother depended on, considering the poisonous atmosphere in which she grew up? Among all the information that leaked from the open files, one particular project has remained in a really unnerving manner with the public. In one nearly incredible business model, it encapsulates the entire repulsive moral conflict of this tale. Sarah Ferguson was developing a brand for women's empowerment. She had even given it a name, Mother's Army. Named specifically after Mother's protective tendency, it was presented as a large campaign centered totally music, around the concept of supporting, elevating, and fiercely advocating for women. However, Ferguson's advanced business plans for this admirable endeavor included giving the financier a controlling 51% ownership stake, according to the leaked letter. According to the records, the man whose name would later become a worldwide symbol for the systematic, abhorrent exploitation of young women and girls was positioned as the majority owner of a company whose claimed goal was women's empowerment. The arrangement's dark cynicism was wonderful. Ferguson would hold the shine music. Title: he would actually be in charge, but she would deliver the motivational speeches and be the happy royal face that the donors, partners, and the media would see. Following a meal that Ferguson, music Prince Andrew B. Tatrick, and Eugenie attended, one of his associates sent an email outlining the possible business benefits of this perverse system in language that were purposeful and brutally clinical. Among the advantages mentioned were Ferguson's royal connections and elite social network. Eugenie and B. Tatrick were there at the event in person. While this commercial deal was being arranged, they were seated in the room. As the grown-ups in their lives casually talked about music, they talked about how a known predator could profit from a women's empowerment initiative and who would own it. The planning was progressed, but it's uncertain if the ultimate ownership transfer was ever officially signed. Music: the intention was recorded in black and white. When this correspondence's entire, unredacted content was made public online, the fallout came swiftly and from several angles all at once. In a matter of days, charitable organizations that had been happily linked with Sarah Ferguson for years, music, raced to cut links. When the stakes are high, being connected to a crisis of this radioactive scale is not a workable PR blip in the music world of elite giving, where institutional reputation dictates everything from billionaire donor confidence to public believability. It poses an existential risk. The companies that let her go were getting frosty. Difficult computation, but the maths was straightforward. She was under the same pressure in her business life. Over many years, Ferguson has made enormous energy investments in an effort to re-establish a reliable source of income. Her profession as a writer, which included children's books and romance novels, served as a lifeline of stability that had been extremely difficult following decades of financial turmoil and tabloid mocking. However, news about music abruptly surfaced, suggesting that publishers were applying the brakes. There were sudden changes to the release dates. There were apparently frantic talks going on behind closed doors over how to manage her book's current warehouse stock. Despite their seeming insignificance, these business subtleties have enormous significance. The willingness of a major publisher to halt a release is purely commercial. It indicates that those with millions of dollars on the line have fulfilled their market investigation and came to the conclusion that there is no longer any demand for this women. Ferguson saw this change as a terrible return to the unstable financial situation from which she had sold her soul. The British public's reaction was completely different. It was loud, aggressive, and incredibly furious. The tone of the public response was something that commentators who had spent 30 years covering the strange activities of the royal family had seldom seen. This was not your typical disapproval. It wasn't the typical royal scandal tiredness. Music: it was a visceral, intensely felt moral repulsion. When the term national disgrace started to gain popularity, it was used to Ferguson and her ex-husband Andrew. Enraged demands were made for official repercussions, a genuine public accounting, and for the palace to finally take action and stop hiding behind its gates. However, the palace enormous issue, there was much more to this controversy than just a divorced duchess. It penetrated the institution's symbolic core. Unquestionably, a family member arranged for a prisoner to get a secret VIP tour of Buckingham Palace involving the blood princesses was more than just a tale of poor decision-making by one woman. It was a horrifying account of the monarchy's true state as an institution. It posed risky queries. What is the ultimate authority? Who is granted access to the crown, and why, as they almost usually do in The royal family reacted to terrible music crises with utterly deafening silence. They established physical space, made no pronouncements, and tacitly relied on the idea that the constant 24-hour news cycle would eventually do what a PR statement was unable to. Music, don't overdo it. Hold off, have faith that people will become sidetracked. However, the sheer essence of this particular plot prevents it from progressing. The American judicial system is still in flux. Digital detectives continue to uncover, translate, and examine more documents. Every new development is guaranteed to receive front-page international attention due to music and the direct involvement of individuals associated with the most well-known royal family in the world. The pressure for genuine accountability is not lessening on a global scale. Will King Charles have to reply at some point? Will there be a formal title or distance? Reviews: it is becoming more and more unrealistic to think that the Crown can just wait this out. We have now reached the very center of this whole nightmare, the query that underlies all emails, flight logs, and cancelled book deals. The question for which there is no clear solution and might not have one for decades. What do Eugenie and Beatrice really know? Behind those closed music doors, what did they see? And now that they are adults, what, if anything, do they plan to do about it? These are not philosophical inquiries that are abstract. They ultimately determine whether or not a complete and truthful account of what transpired during those difficult times is ever truly feasible. Because no number of flight logs, no matter how reliable, and no collection of recovered emails, no matter how damning, can match the unquestionable human and evidentiary weight of first-hand testimony from someone who was present in the room. Music: Eugene and Beatrice were present in person. 5 days after the prison doors opened, they strolled on Miami's tarmac. At the 18th birthday celebration, candles were blown out. At the mother's army business dinner, they consumed the food. The correspondence is intertwined with their names. They talked about their schedules. They were utilized as social currency, and their access was normalized. The rest of the world can only speculate about what they know. If you were, what would you do if you were one of these two women? Take a moment to truly put yourself in their position. What does the right decision even look like if you were raised in this distorted world, attended these events as a teenager, and had your entire worldview molded by a mother who depended on a monster to make ends meet? Do you destroy your own mother by speaking out? Music? Do you remain completely silent to shield your own young children from the negative effects of the media? Is there a version of this story in which it is morally right to keep music, your mouth shut, or does quiet eventually give way to its own kind of collusion? To act as though their decision is easy is completely unfair. They didn't request this music. As defenseless teenagers, they were pulled into this underworld. The choices that put them in the path of a worldwide predator were made by the adults who were meant to keep them safe. However, they made it through it. The world is still watching music to see if they will ever violate the royal code of silence. This is what we can be certain of. The files are real as the dust. Music continues to settle. The emails are kept on file indefinitely. The timeline has been verified and is perfect. The trip to Miami took place. The birthday celebration took place. There were business talks about the women's empowerment brand. These are no longer unspoken rumors. They have been established, facts from documentaries. Two young women who are currently attempting to lead normal lives were in the dead center of it all, while the ghosts of their mother's decisions continue to try to pull them back. The term that maintains leverage appears in every forensic analysis of this case. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't bad decision-making. Leverage was the reason. The horrifying implication is that the daughter's existence in that world was a resource, a shiny royal coin, rather than a tragic accident. Keep the vault doors open, hold a position, and maintain a cash flow. Was Sarah Ferguson duped? Of course. The destitute, lonely, and financially ruined are the targets of predators, and she was all three of them. However, that justification vanishes. The discussion then shifts to her daughters. They were far more susceptible than she was. Furthermore, there is compelling evidence that their safety was, at most, an afterthought. The strain is increasing. The legal proceedings are far from finished. And the full, unadulterated truth of what transpired in the shadows of the monarchy is kept hidden until those present finally choose to speak. And that silence is the loudest, most deafening thing in the room right now. If you believe that more people should be asking the questions this in-depth analysis raised, Distribute this video. The discussion about real accountability for each and every individual who profited from this dark network is still ongoing. To ensure that you don't miss the next significant development, make sure to subscribe, because the next chapter is always just around the corner in a story with ties this deep.